डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Namaskar. Welcome to the video lecture series offered by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. I, Dr. Reena Vaishnav, Assistant Professor in English. Today in this session, we are going to discuss about what is criticism, what is literary theory, right? And how they are interconnected with each other. So, let me start our session. So, in this session, today, what we are going to discuss, what is literary theory, what is literary criticism, a relationship between literary theory and literary criticism, functions of criticism, types of criticism. In types, we are going to discuss in very brief manner like legislative criticism, judicial criticism, theoretical criticism, historical criticism, comparative criticism, impressionistic criticism, textual or you can say ontological criticism, sociological criticism, psychological and ecocriticism. It means in paper 5, MA part 2, it is block 1, an introduction about literary theory and criticism. So, let's dive into our topic. So, if you think like if you have one question about that, like what is literary criticism? What is literary theory? How will you define this term? Is they are interconnected? Is they are same or different? That we are going to discuss. The word criticism is derived from the Greek word kritein, which means to judge, and the one who is skilled in judging is known as kritikos in Greek and critic in English. Criticism by definition is the act or art of analyzing and judging the quality of a literary or artistic work. Criticism is the exercise of judgment in the you can say province of art and literature, and the critic is the person who is possessed of the knowledge necessary to enable him to pronounce right judgment upon the merit or worth of such works as come within this province. Right? In fact, you can say the history of literary criticism runs parallel to the history of literature. In ancient Greece, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, wrote a major critical treatise called Poetics in 4th BC, still considered a highly important and influential work of literary study, especially his concepts of mimesis and catharsis. Aristotle based his theories on epic and tragedy. After a careful study of the works of Homer and Sophocles. So, in simple says, if I have to say, the English word theory is derived from the Greek word theoria, which means contemplation or speculation. Literary criticism is the practical application of literary theory because criticism always deals with literary work from a theoretical perspective. The two activities are closely related to each other, right? So, in this way, if I have to say, like there is a one critic, John Hopkins, in his work Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism, makes no distinction between literary theory and criticism and always describe them as same concept. The first recorded, you can say, instance of criticism go back to dramatic festivals in ancient Athens, which were organized as a contest, requiring an official judgment as to which author had produced the best drama. A particularly striking literary critical discussion occurs in Aristophanes' one work. The play, its name is The Frogs, which was first performed in 405 BC, just before the ending of the war, 404 BC, 404 BC you can say. In the utter defeat of Athens at the hands of the rival Sparta, it may seem odd in our age of highly technical and specialized approaches to literature that literary criticism should be used to entertain and amuse a large audience of several thousand people, right? So, you can say criticism, as Aristotle first instituted, it was meant as a standard of judging well, and the term critic in the literary application is as old as Bacon's advancement of learning. It was Dryden who was the first to use the word criticism in print, right? And in now accepted sense of any formal discussion of literature, you can say it. Dr. Johnson defined a critic as a person skilled in the art of judging literature, a man able to distinguish the faults and beauties of writing. And criticism is the task of determining principles to evaluate the merits of literary composition. Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century English writer, considered literary criticism as interpretation and an assessment of merit of a work of art. So, Dr. Johnson, Dryden, Thomas Carlyle, they have given their views on criticism. Thus, it becomes clear that criticism is the branch of study concerned with defining, classifying, interpreting, and evaluating works of literature. When literary theory has an application, orientation, it becomes literary criticism. Therefore, theory and practice interact with each other. You can say I.R. Richards, in 20th century critic, you can say, right? In 20th century, there was a very famous critic, I.R. Richards. He has written in his work, he has written two major books, Principles of Literary Criticism and Practical Criticism, Integrated Theory and Practice in their literary studies. You can say he was an exponent of a method called practical and applied criticism. It was a close study of literature that paid more attention to all the details of the text. Richards argued the twin pillars upon which theory of criticism, you can say theory of criticism, must rest are an account of value and an account of communication. After that, John Middleton Murray, a renowned 20th century critic who was, you can say, radical in his views, he stated, what is criticism? In this way, he stated that true criticism is itself an organic part of the whole activity of art. Right? In same way, there is another American critic, Jonathan Culler, said, literary theory is interdisciplinary. It is a discourse with effects outside an original discipline and analytical and speculative. There is no literature without criticism. Literature exists in criticism. For Eliot, literary criticism is not a perception of literature. He accumulated as a mass, but structured perception and rational analysis of literature. In 1970, the most well-known philosopher of contemporary times and the founder of the school of deconstruction theory, Jacques Derrida, stated in one interview that literary criticism is highly theoretical and is highly considered to be more philosophical than literature itself. Now, we have discussed about, what exactly is criticism? What is criticism? What is literary theory? How they are interconnected with each other, right? How critics like I.A. Richards, John Middleton Murray, Jacques Derrida, Dryden, Dr. Johnson, what are their views about the term, you can say on the term criticism. Now, in next point, we are going to discuss about functions of criticism, right? Functions of criticism. According to Scriber, criticism is the play of mind on a work of literature, and it consists in asking and answering rational questions about literature. The business of literary critic is, in the first instance, to distinguish between a good book and a bad one, and that done to help us to recognize for ourselves and to get full value out of literary quality when we meet with it. Thus, opening for us the whole world of pleasure and imaginative experience, which is waiting to be explored, but which without a qualified critic help, we would not discover for ourselves. The ways in which the critic sets about his task are innumerable. On the one hand, the most general statements of principles to a detailed line by line and word by word analysis of one short poem. On the other hand, you can say you can refine to quicken and refine your own and the reader's perspectiveness, so that as times go on, we too may come to share his understanding and pleasures what best in literature. Dr. Johnson considered Dryden as father of English criticism. Dryden is called as the father of English criticism. Dryden, in his Apology for Heroic Poetry, he says that it's not the business of criticism to detect pretty faults, but to discover those great beauties that make it immortal. Fault finding is not the function of criticism. Gone the days when rigid critics acted like a hangman of literature. Their main aim was to lay their hands on imperfection and faults in the works of literature. But today, the function of criticism is not to find faults, but to make a just evaluation of artist work. Basically, criticism contains two functions: judgment and appreciation. Till 18th century, the critic was looked upon the judge, who pronounced the merits and demerits. You can say merits and demerits of the work. B. Worsfold writes that criticism is the exercise of judgment in the province of art and literature. The other function of criticism is appreciation. Appreciation mainly, you can say, it is related to romantic or impressionistic criticism. After the French Revolution, criticism, along with the rest of literature, shook off the shackles of classical authority. Wordsworth feels that a work of art carries its own elements of enjoyment and has its own mode of impression. Walter Peter writes that the function of criticism is to distinguish, to analyze and to separate the virtue by which a picture, a landscape produce this spatial impression of beauty or pleasure, to indicate what the source of that impression is and under what condition it is experienced. The doctrines of Aristotle don't enter in appreciative criticism. This form of criticism is entirely subjective. The critic is concerned only with expressing what he himself has felt in the presence of the work of art or literature. The critic is not affected by what others have said about their own response to the same work. Appreciative criticism expected to ascertain the viewpoint and intention of the writer. Thomas Carlyle says the critic's first and foremost duty is to make plain to itself, and poet's aim really and truly was how the task he had to do stood before his eye, and how far with such materials as were afforded to him, he has, you can say, fulfilled it. So, the critic is mainly concerned only with expressing what he himself has felt in the presence of the work of art, or you can say art of literature. So these are the functions of criticism which you can, go through it. Now, our next topic, it is about types of literary criticism. We are going to discuss about set types of literary criticism in a very brief manner. There are various types of criticism that have, you can say that have flourished from time to time. In a latest tradition, we have a new type like ecocriticism. What it is, that we are going to also discuss. Okay, so let's discuss some of the types of criticism in a very brief manner. So the first one is legislative criticism. What does it mean? Legislative criticism, it means what? So, legislative criticism claims to teach the poet how to write or how to write better. It is a kind of criticism practiced by the Elizabethans. Nearly all the Elizabethan critics directed their remarks to the poets rather than the readers of poetry. Their writings, for the most part depressingly uninspired, are the critical equivalent than the recipe book, and they are based mainly on master chef's assumption. And that, what kind of assumption? That any student of good intelligence can learn the business if only he is shown how. Right? So, what is a legislative criticism? You just have to keep in mind, like that criticism claims to teach the poet how to write and how to write better. Another type of criticism is judicial criticism. This criticism seeks to pronounce judgment on works of literature on the basis of certain rules. If a work is found to follow these rules, it is a good. If not, it is condemned as worthless. Such rules derived from ancient Greek and Latin masters, especially Aristotle and Horace. Dr. Johnson may be regarded as the most powerful exponent of this kind of criticism. So, how will you define judicial criticism? Judicial criticism, it mainly, it seeks to pronounce judgment on works of literature on basis of certain rules. If that rules are going to follow, it means it is a good work. If it is not going to follow it, it means it is worthless. So, our next type of criticism is theoretical criticism. In this way, you can define judicial criticism. Now, our next type is theoretical criticism. So, this kind of criticism mainly deals with literary aesthetics. Attention is focused not on particular works, but on literature in general. In England, theoretical criticism made its humble beginning in Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. It is a work by Philip Sidney. In 17th century, Dryden showed keen interest in literary aesthetics. From this time onwards, interest shifts away from such Platonic issues as the nature of poetic truth towards such psychological questions as nature of creative act. It means, how will you define this term? Theoretical criticism. So, theoretical criticism, it is mainly based on aesthetics and it mainly focused on particular works, not literature in general. Now, another type of our criticism is evaluative criticism. It is a type of criticism which is concerned with the assessment or evaluation of the worth and significance of a work of art. The work concerned with reference to standards which may be aesthetics, moral, or purely personal. T.S. Eliot considers moral and ethical standards as necessary to determine the greatness of a work of literature, which cannot be determined merely by literary standards. So, mainly evaluative criticism is concerned with the assessment or the evaluation of the worth and significance of a work of art. Now, our next type is historical criticism. What it is? How will you define this term? Historical criticism. How will you define this type? Historical criticism. It views the work of art against the background of the age in which it was written. It means if Shakespeare writes any works, so how sociological and historical background it affects his mindset and how it can reflect in his work, right? So, historical criticism is mainly based, or you can say mainly the view is on the work of art against the background of the age in which it was written. I have said like every writer is influenced by the age in which he lives, and his work cannot properly be estimated without an understanding of the social, economic, religious, political, and literary trends. These all are the, you can say situations which influence the writer. I have already given you example of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's work cannot be understood without knowledge of the social and political life of the day. So, how will you define this type, historical criticism? It means historical criticism, it is a work of art against the background of the age in which it was written. Its social, economical, political conditions. It also reflects in writers' works. So, such kinds of criticism we can include in historical criticism. Our next type of literary criticism is comparative criticism. What is comparative criticism? This criticism seeks to evaluate a work by comparing it with other works of similar nature or either in one's own language. Means you have to compare the work. This method is foreshadowed in the criticism of Dryden. But Arnold was its first powerful advocate and exponent. So, in comparative criticism, mainly you have to focus on it seeks to evaluate a work by comparing it with other works, right? Now, our next type is impressionistic criticism. How will you define it? So, impressionistic criticism is what happens when a critic is reading a piece of work and critiques it on how he or she is feeling instead of critiquing using principles. Another time I repeat it. Impressionistic criticism is what happens when a critic is reading a piece of work and critiques it on how he or she is feeling instead of using principles. So if you choose to be an impressionistic critic, you are your own audience. You are a writer and you read your work, your piece of work, your piece of literary work as a reader. By using your senses, you are acting as an impressionistic critic. Impressionistic critic is the, you can say, record of personal response. It is a record of the critic's own appreciation of aesthetic beauty. The critic does not evaluate a work. He does not call it good or bad. Rather, he seeks to convey his own enjoyment of it to his readers. In very simple words, if I have to say, what is impressionistic criticism? How will you define this type? So, in simple sense, you can say, when a critic is reading a piece of work and critiques it on how he or she is feeling instead of critiquing using principles. It means as a reader, how he reacts to that piece of work, right? So, such kinds of characteristics or things we can include it in impressionistic criticism. Our next types of criticism is textual, or you can say ontological criticism. In the modern age, there are a number of dominant trends or approaches to criticism. First and the most important, there is a textual or ontological. For the ontological critic, the text under consideration is the thing in itself, and it is examined and analyzed without any consideration of such factors as like a biography, history, sociology, psychology, etc. The critic mainly concentrates on the structure of the poem, on the various elements that combines to make up that structure, like words, diction, language, image, meter, tone, theme, etc. are all closely studied. So, ontological criticism, it means that the text under consideration is the thing in itself, and it is examined and analyzed without any consideration of such factors like biography, history, sociology, psychology. It means text is everything. You don't have to study about what is the sociological background when this work is written, right? You don't have to worry about historical, sociological or psychological backgrounds. Even you don't have to consider the biography of the writers also, right? Our next type is sociological criticism. So, another kind of criticism which enjoys much popularity in our 20th century is sociological criticism. Sociological criticism starts with a conviction that art's relation to society is vitally important. Weber Scott says, art is not created in vacuum. It is the work not simply of a person but an author fixed in a time, space, answering to a community of which he is an important and articulate part. Our next type of criticism is psychoanalytical criticism. In simple sense, I just give you one example. It is a mind-boggling world. With all the scientific and materialistic development, life has become more comfortable. Anything can be accomplished with the click of a button. Whether it's a transaction of money, buying a commodity, applying for a job booking, a railway ticket, or ordering a pizza, everything is at the tip of our fingers. However, with the being said, our mind is still often not at peace with itself. There is a something that it craves for, something that is, it wants to achieve, something that it wants to get, but it not able to win it. What is this thing? What are we running about? What do we want to achieve? Why are we not satisfied soul? Psychoanalysis is a method of understanding our own mind, its functioning. Psychoanalysis helps understand child psychology, human psychology, and social psychology. Psychoanalytical thinking enriches several academic fields. It is a tool for interpretation of psyche, which has been applied to further understanding of art, literature, and history. Psychoanalysts work on developing a sophisticated methodology of understanding the brain and human minds. Psychoanalysis is also helpful in therapy. With the help of psychoanalysis, you can cure the perception of the mind. Psychoanalysis develops a deeper into the minds and tries to find the root cause of the problem. Hence, it is necessarily, can be determined. Now, our last type of criticism is ecocriticism. So, ecocriticism is the study of literature from an ecological or environmental perspective. It is the study of explicitly environmental text from any critical perspective or the application of various environmental lenses to any kind of a text. William Ricketts may have been the first person to use the term ecocriticism. Simon Stock notes in a report card on ecocriticism that ecocriticism has distinguished itself debates notwithstanding, firstly, by the ethical stand it takes, its commitments to the nature world as an important thing rather than simply as an object of thematic study, and secondly, by its commitment to making connection. It is also viewed as a study of culture and cultural products. Right? So that is in some way connected with the human relationship to the natural world. To an extent, it is a response to needs, problems or crises depending on one's perception of urgency. First, ecocriticism is a response to the need for humanistic understanding of our relationship with the natural world in an age of environmental destruction. And secondly, environmental crises are a result of humanity's disconnection from the natural world, brought about not only increasing technology but also by failing to recognize the interconnectedness of all things. So now in this session we have discussed about what is criticism, what is literary theory, how they are interconnected. We have also discussed about some major critics in very brief manner. We have also discussed about types of criticism in a very brief manner. You can identify now what is a historical criticism. So, now we conclude our session here. Namaskar.